Grace Harper was a woman who defied expectations in every sense of the word. At 60 years old, she carried herself with a confidence and grace that could command a room without ever raising her voice. Her life had been one of discipline, resilience, and a quiet strength born from years of challenges and hard-won victories. Grace was no stranger to adversity. She had spent decades not only surviving but thriving in a world that often underestimated her. A sculptor by trade and a martial artist by passion, she had spent years perfecting both crafts. Her sculptures, often described as a blend of raw power and delicate intricacy, reflected the duality of her own nature, a woman capable of immense strength, but also deeply connected to the beauty of the world. On this particular evening, Grace was wrapping up a long day. She had just finished teaching a self-defense class at the local community center, a program she had started years ago to help women feel safer and more confident in their daily lives. The students adored her. Many saw her as a mentor and a symbol of empowerment. Tonight's class had been particularly fulfilling. Grace had guided a group of young women through a series of exercises designed to not only protect themselves physically but also to build mental resilience. As the last student left, thanking her profusely, Grace felt a small sense of satisfaction. Moments like these reminded her why she had started teaching in the first place. The evening air was crisp as Grace stepped outside, her gym bag slung over her shoulder. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the quiet streets were bathed in the silver glow of moonlight. The city felt peaceful, almost serene, but Grace knew better than to take that for granted. Years of experience had taught her that danger often lurked where one least expected it. As she walked through the park on her way home, the faint rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic served as a reminder of the world's unpredictable nature. The park was mostly empty, save for a few scattered figures, some joggers, others walking their dogs, but none of them seemed particularly noteworthy. As she walked, Grace couldn't shake a subtle feeling of being watched. It wasn't overt or alarming, just a faint prickling at the back of her neck, the kind of sensation that her years of martial arts training had taught her to respect. She paused for a moment, glancing over her shoulder. The path behind her was empty, illuminated only by the soft glow of streetlights. Shaking off the feeling, she adjusted her bag and continued walking, her footsteps steady and deliberate. Unbeknownst to Grace, Officer David Wilks was watching her from a distance. Wilks was a man who carried his bitterness like a second badge. His career in law enforcement had not gone the way he had envisioned. Years ago, he had joined the force with dreams of heroism and respect, but those dreams had eroded under the weight of bureaucratic frustrations and his own personal failures. Now in his late 30s, Wilks was an officer with a chip on his shoulder and a growing sense of resentment. He had developed a habit of projecting his frustrations onto the world around him, often targeting those who, in his mind, represented the problems with society. When Wilks spotted Grace walking alone through the park, his suspicions were immediately piqued. To him, her presence at this hour seemed out of place, and the gym bag slung over her shoulder looked suspicious. In reality, there was nothing unusual about Grace's appearance. She was dressed in comfortable athletic wear, her hair tied back in a simple braid, but Wilks' biases led him to view her through a distorted lens. His internal narrative quickly spiraled. Why was she here? What was in the bag? Was she meeting someone for an illicit purpose? These assumptions, unfounded as they were, solidified in his mind as fact. Grace continued walking, unaware of the officer trailing her. The path wound through a denser section of the park, where the trees cast long shadows across the ground. She adjusted her bag again, her senses on alert, though she still couldn't pinpoint the source of her unease. Then, out of the quiet, a sharp voice cut through the night. "Hey, stop right there." Grace froze mid-step, her head turning toward the sound. Standing several yards behind her was Officer Wilks, his hand resting on his belt. His tone was authoritative, almost aggressive, and it immediately set off alarms in Grace's mind. She had encountered officers like him before, men who wielded their power like a weapon rather than a responsibility. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression calm but guarded. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. Wilks took a few steps closer, his posture rigid and his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded. "It's late. You got somewhere you're supposed to be." Grace raised an eyebrow, taken aback by the accusatory tone. "I'm just walking home," she replied evenly. "I don't see how that's a problem." Wilks narrowed his eyes, his hand inching closer to the baton on his belt. "What's in the bag?" he asked sharply. Grace instinctively tightened her grip on the strap. "Just my workout gear," she said, her tone still calm but firmer now. "Nothing illegal, if that's what you're implying." Wilks didn't like her response. He had expected her to be nervous, maybe even apologetic, but instead she was composed and unyielding. It irritated him. In his mind, her calm demeanor was a sign of defiance, an affront to his authority. "Let me see it," he ordered, taking another step closer. Grace's eyes flicked to the baton on his belt, then back to his face. She could see the tension in his jaw, the barely contained anger simmering beneath the surface. "I don't think that's necessary," she said carefully. "I haven't done anything wrong." Wilks' patience snapped. "I'm not asking," he barked. "I'm telling you. Open the bag or I'll do it for you." Grace hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to tread carefully. She had seen situations like this escalate before, and she knew how quickly things could spiral out of control. Slowly, she set the bag down on the ground and unzipped it, revealing a pair of training gloves, a towel, and a set of wooden practice knives used in martial arts demonstrations. Wilks stared at the contents, his expression hardening. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, picking up one of the practice knives. "You some kind of street fighter?" Grace let out a slow breath, her patience wearing thin. "Those are training tools," she explained. "I teach self-defense classes at the community center." Wilks scoffed, his grip tightening on the practice knife. "Yeah, right," he muttered. "Looks like you're gearing up for something else to me." Grace straightened her posture, her eyes locking onto his. "Officer, I've been polite, and I've answered your questions," she said firmly. "Now, unless you have a legitimate reason to detain me, I'd like to be on my way." Wilks took another step closer, his presence looming. "You don't tell me how to do my job," he snarled. "I decide when you're free to go, not you." Grace's heart rate quickened, but she refused to show any sign of fear. This was no longer a simple misunderstanding, it was a power play, and she knew it. She also knew she had to be careful. One wrong move, and the situation could escalate beyond her control. "Then what do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with steel. For a moment, the two of them stood there, locked in a silent standoff, the tension thick in the air. Wilks narrowed his eyes, the flicker of frustration growing in his expression as Grace's composed demeanor continued to unsettle him. He wasn't used to this. People usually faltered under his scrutiny, whether out of guilt, fear, or the simple desire to avoid conflict. But not her. Grace stood firm, her gaze unwavering as if she was dissecting him in return. It wasn't defiance, but something more calculated, a quiet resolve that gnawed at his already bruised ego. He felt the familiar stir of anger rise, a response he often justified as righteous authority, but was rooted in something darker: his frustration with the world, with himself, and with people like her who refused to bend to his will. "You've got a lot of nerve talking to an officer like that," Wilks snapped, his hand now resting firmly on the baton at his side. The weight of it was a comfort, a reminder of the control he believed he had in moments like these. "Let me spell it out for you. I'm not here to negotiate. You're going to answer my questions, do as I say, and stop giving me attitude. Understood?" Grace didn't flinch. Her martial arts training had drilled into her the importance of reading body language, and Wilks was broadcasting his intentions loud and clear. The tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers flexed near the baton, the clipped edge of his voice, he was primed for a confrontation, and he wanted her to be the one to ignite it. But Grace had no intention of playing his game. She had faced tougher opponents in sparring matches and tougher people in life. She wasn't going to let his intimidation tactics rattle her. "I'm not giving you attitude," she said evenly, her voice steady as a rock. "I'm asserting my rights. There's a difference." The words landed like a slap. Wilks' face darkened, his jaw tightening as he took another step closer, his presence looming over her. Grace instinctively shifted her stance, grounding herself, though her outward demeanor remained calm. She could feel the heat of his frustration radiating off him, his need to assert dominance over a situation he felt slipping out of his grasp. "You think you're clever, huh?" Wilks said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Walking around here like you own the place, carrying whatever the hell this is," he gestured toward her gym bag, "and acting like I'm the one in the wrong. Let me guess, you think you're above the law?" Grace's lips pressed into a thin line. She could sense where this was headed, and every fiber of her being screamed for her to remain composed. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered someone like Wilks, someone who mistook calm self-assurance for insolence, who saw her refusal to cower as a challenge to their authority. But that didn't make it any less exhausting. Every interaction like this was a tightrope walk, a precarious balancing act between protecting herself and avoiding unnecessary escalation. "I never said I was above the law," she replied, her voice measured. "But I know it well enough to recognize when it's being misused. And right now, officer, I've done nothing to warrant this level of hostility." Wilks' nostrils flared, his grip tightening on the baton, as if the weight of it might anchor his spiraling emotions. For a moment, the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves overhead and the distant hum of a car passing on a nearby street. Grace could see the internal battle playing out in his expression, the clash between his professional facade and the raw anger simmering beneath it. She knew men like him thrived on control, and her refusal to crumble was like a match to dry kindling. "You know what?" Wilks said abruptly, his voice rising. "Enough of this. Turn around and put your hands on your head." Grace blinked, the command catching her off guard. "Excuse me," she said, her tone laced with disbelief. "You heard me," he barked, his voice sharp and cutting. "Turn around. Hands on your head. Now." "For what?" Grace demanded, her composure slipping slightly as incredulity crept into her voice. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" Wilks' eyes flashed with a mix of irritation and something more dangerous determination. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them until they were just a few feet apart. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said, his tone low and menacing. "You're acting suspicious, you're carrying potential weapons, and you're refusing to cooperate. That's enough reason for me." Grace's breath caught in her chest, a wave of anger and disbelief washing over her. Potential weapons. Suspicious behavior. She had done nothing but walk through a park and carry her gym bag, And yet here she was, being treated like a criminal for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The injustice of it all sparked something deep within her, a fire that she had long ago learned to control but never extinguish. She clenched her fists at her sides, forcing herself to breathe, to think, to stay calm. "Officer," she said slowly, her voice steadier than she felt, "you're crossing a line. I've complied with your questions, I've shown you what's in my bag, and I've made it clear that I pose no threat. If you have no legitimate reason to detain me, I'd like to go." But Wilks wasn't listening. His hand moved to the baton at his side, his fingers curling around the handle as he pulled it free from its holster. The motion was deliberate, calculated, a not-so-subtle reminder of the power he believed he held over her. Grace's heart pounded in her chest, but her expression remained neutral. She had been trained for moments like this, though she had never imagined having to use those skills against someone who was supposed to uphold the law. "Last chance," Wilks growled, pointing the baton toward her. "Do as I say, or I'll make you." Grace's eyes flicked to the baton, then back to his face. Her body tensed, her muscles coiled like a spring as her mind raced through the possibilities. She didn't want this to escalate, but she wasn't going to let him bully her into submission either. She had spent her entire life fighting for her autonomy, her dignity, her right to exist without fear, and she wasn't about to let him strip that away. "I'm not resisting," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "But I'm not going to let you intimidate me either." Wilks' expression twisted with anger, his patience snapping like a brittle twig. He lunged forward, the baton raised, his intentions clear. In that split second, Grace's training took over. She sidestepped his charge with practiced ease, her movements fluid and precise. As he stumbled past her, thrown off balance by her agility, she reached out and deflected his arm, sending the baton clattering to the ground. The sound of the baton hitting the pavement echoed through the park, a sharp, metallic clang that seemed to hang in the air. Wilks whipped around, his face a mask of fury, but Grace was already poised, her stance solid and unshakable. Her eyes locked onto his, a storm of resolve brewing in their depths. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was electric, charged with the weight of everything that had led to this point. Grace knew the situation had crossed a line, but she also knew she couldn't back down now. Wilks, on the other hand, seemed torn between retreating and doubling down, his pride and his temper waging war within him. It was a standoff, and Grace was ready for whatever came next. The baton lay on the ground between them, its metallic glint catching the faint light of the street lamps. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Grace stood firm, her posture calm but prepared, while Officer Wilks stared at her, his face a contorted mix of rage and disbelief. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her to move so quickly, so decisively. His training hadn't prepared him for someone like her, controlled, precise, and completely unintimidated by his aggression. For the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Grace kept her eyes locked on him, her breathing steady. She wasn't about to make the first move. She knew this was a delicate moment, a precipice where any wrong step could send them both tumbling into chaos. But Wilks, his pride wounded and his authority questioned, had no intention of letting things de-escalate. To him, this was no longer about protocol or law enforcement, this was personal. "You think you're clever? Huh?" Wilks growled, his voice low and venomous. He took a step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel path. His hand hovered near his hip, where his taser rested, and Grace's eyes flicked to the movement. She didn't flinch. didn't react outwardly, but her body shifted ever so slightly, readying itself for whatever might come next. "You don't get to walk away from this. You don't get to disrespect me." Grace's voice was calm, steady as a rock. "Officer, I've done nothing to disrespect you. But you're crossing a line here, and I suggest you think carefully about your next move." Her words only seemed to fuel his anger. Wilks clenched his fists, his knuckles white against the night. His mind raced, every ounce of his authority feeling like it was slipping through his fingers. He had spent years cultivating this image of himself strong, commanding, feared. But now, in front of this woman who refused to be cowed, he felt exposed, weak, and he hated it. "Hands behind your head," he barked, his voice rising. "Now." Grace didn't move. She held her ground, her gaze unwavering. "I've complied with your demands," she said. "I've shown you what's in my bag. I've made it clear I'm no threat. You're the one escalating this situation." Wilks' face twisted with frustration. He was losing control, and he knew it. Without warning, he lunged forward, reaching for Grace's arm. But Grace had seen the move coming from the subtle shift in his stance, the tightening of his jaw. In one fluid motion, she stepped to the side, avoiding his grasp and twisting her body to maintain distance. His hand swiped through empty air, and the momentum of his failed grab sent him stumbling forward. "Stop resisting," he shouted, though there was no resistance to speak of, only his own inability to overpower her. Grace's voice was sharp, cutting through his frustration like a blade. "I'm not resisting, officer. I'm defending myself from your aggression." Her words struck a nerve, and Wilks spun around, his face flushed with anger. His hand shot to his hip, pulling his taser free from its holster. The yellow device gleamed in the dim light as he pointed it at her, his grip unsteady. Grace's eyes narrowed, her body tensing. She had trained for moments like this, but even years of preparation couldn't entirely quell the surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Don't make me use this," Wilks warned, though his tone lacked the confidence he was trying to project. He wasn't used to being challenged, and it showed. "You're escalating this unnecessarily," Grace said, her voice firm but calm. "Put the taser down, and let's talk like adults. There's no need for violence." But Wilks wasn't listening. His mind was a storm of emotions: anger, humiliation, and the desperate need to reassert control. He pressed the button, and the taser fired with a sharp crackle, sending two electrified prongs hurtling toward Grace. But she was ready. Her body moved on instinct, honed through years of training. She sidestepped the wires, the prongs embedding harmlessly into the ground behind her. Before Wilks could react, Grace closed the distance between them. Her movements were fluid, deliberate. She reached out, grabbing the taser with one hand while simultaneously twisting his wrist with the other. The device slipped from his grip, and in a single motion, Grace tossed it to the side, well out of reach. Wilks let out a frustrated snarl, his free hand shooting up to shove her away. But Grace anticipated the move. She stepped into him, using his own momentum to sweep his legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard, the impact sending a cloud of dust into the air. For a moment he lay there, stunned, the wind knocked out of him. Grace stepped back, giving him space. She wasn't looking to hurt him, only to neutralize the threat. Her breathing was steady, her hands relaxed at her sides. She watched as Wilks scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of fury and embarrassment. He reached for his baton, still lying on the ground, but Grace's voice stopped him in his tracks. "Don't," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "This doesn't have to go any further." Wilks hesitated, his hand hovering over the baton. His chest heaved with labored breaths, his mind racing. He was at a crossroads, and he knew it. Every instinct screamed at him to retaliate, to reassert his dominance, But there was a small, nagging voice in the back of his mind, logic, reason, self-preservation that urged him to stop. But pride is a dangerous thing. With a growl of frustration, Wilks snatched up the baton and charged at Grace, swinging it with all the force he could muster. Grace's movements were a blur. She ducked under the swing, her body twisting gracefully as she sidestepped his attack. In the same motion, she reached out, catching his arm and redirecting the force of his swing. The baton slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground once more. Wilks stumbled, his balance thrown off by the sudden shift. Grace seized the opportunity. She stepped in close, using her shoulder to nudge him off-center while sweeping his legs out from under him again. This time he hit the ground even harder, landing flat on his back with a pained grunt. Grace took a step back, her posture relaxed but ready. She didn't gloat, didn't taunt him. Her expression was calm, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos of the moment. Wilks lay on the ground, staring up at the night sky. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, and for a brief moment, the fight seemed to leave him. He looked up at Grace, his face a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. Defeat, perhaps. Humiliation, or maybe, deep down, a grudging respect for the woman who had bested him without breaking a sweat. Grace didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her actions had spoken louder than any words could. She stood there, still and steady, waiting to see what he would do next. For the first time since their encounter began, Wilks hesitated. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by the flicker of doubt. But then, as if on cue, the distant sound of footsteps broke the silence. Grace's eyes flicked to the side, her body remaining poised. From the shadows, a small group of joggers appeared, their curious gazes darting between her and Wilks. The spell was broken. The standoff had drawn an audience, and Wilks knew it. Whatever semblance of control he thought he had was gone. The tension hung in the air, heavy and unresolved, as the two of them stood at an impasse. But Grace knew this wasn't over, not yet. The crowd of joggers lingered on the edge of the scene, their faces painted with a mix of curiosity and confusion. The tension between Grace and Officer Wilks was palpable, a silent battle of wills that radiated out into the night. Wilks, still sprawled on the ground, seemed momentarily paralyzed, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the humiliating reality of the situation. Grace remained motionless, standing tall and composed, her eyes locked on him. She made no attempt to explain herself to the onlookers. Her focus was entirely on Wilks, reading his every movement, anticipating his next decision. Wilks slowly pushed himself up, his face twisted in a mask of anger and wounded pride. He glanced at the joggers, their presence further fueling the fire inside him. He could feel their judgmental stares, their silent questions hanging heavy in the air. What had just happened? Why was an officer on the ground while this woman stood untouched and unwavering? It was a public embarrassment, a challenge to the authority he had always assumed was unshakable. And in his mind, there was only one way to regain control by reasserting that authority, no matter the cost. Back up. Wilks barked at the bystanders, his voice harsh and brittle. This is a police matter. Step away. The joggers exchanged uncertain glances, their feet shuffling but their curiosity keeping them rooted in place. One of them, a middle-aged man with a wary expression, raised his hands in a gesture of appeasement. "Hey, officer, we're just trying to understand what's going on here," he said cautiously. "Is everything all right?" I said, "Back up." Wilks snapped, his tone growing more frantic. He jabbed a finger toward the man, his other hand twitching toward his belt where his radio was clipped. "You don't need to understand anything. This is under control." Grace could see it, the cracks in his composure, the desperation seeping into his voice. He wasn't just angry anymore, he was panicking. The realization brought a mix of emotions bubbling to the surface: sympathy for his clear inner turmoil, frustration at his inability to recognize the damage he was causing, and, above all, a steely resolve not to let his chaotic energy dictate her next move. She shifted her stance slightly, grounding herself further, ready for whatever came next. "Officer," Grace said calmly, her voice cutting through the din like a blade, "you're escalating this unnecessarily. Let's end this here before it gets any worse." Her words were measured, deliberate, but to Wilks they felt like another blow to his authority. He whipped around to face her, his eyes blazing. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he spat, his voice cracking under the weight of his fury. "You're under arrest, and you're coming with me." End of story. "For what?" Grace asked, her tone steady but edged with steel. "What exactly are you charging me with?" "Resisting an officer," Wilks shouted, his voice echoing through the park. "Assault on law enforcement. Take your pick." Grace's jaw tightened, but she refused to rise to his bait. She could feel the eyes of the joggers on her, their collective gaze adding weight to the moment. She took a slow, deliberate breath, centering herself before responding. "I haven't resisted anything," she said firmly, "and the only aggression tonight has come from you. You're out of line, Officer Wilks." Her use of his name struck a nerve. Wilks visibly flinched, his lips curling into a sneer. "You don't know who you're messing with," he snarled, his hand hovering over his radio. "You think you're smart, don't you? Think you can embarrass me and just walk away?" "It's not about embarrassing you," Grace said, her voice softening slightly. "It's about doing the right thing. And right now, you're not." The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Wilks stared at her, his expression a volatile mix of emotions. Then, as if to punctuate the moment, a new sound cut through the tension, the crackle of a police radio. Wilks froze, his head snapping toward the source of the noise. A figure emerged from the shadows, the soft glow of a flashlight illuminating their path. "Wilks," a voice called out, firm and authoritative. "What's going on here?" Grace turned her head toward the newcomer, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the figure. It was another officer, taller and broader than Wilks, his uniform pristine and his demeanor calm. His nameplate read Simmons, and his gaze was sharp and assessing as he took in the scene before him: the battalion lying on the ground, the tense standoff, the small crowd of onlookers. Wilks stiffened, his posture rigid as he turned to face Simmons. "Everything's under control," he said quickly, his voice tight. "I've got this handled." "Doesn't look that way," Simmons replied, his tone neutral but laced with an undercurrent of skepticism. His eyes flicked to Grace, taking in her calm stance and the way she stood her ground. "Mom, are you all right?" Grace nodded slowly. "I'm fine, officer," she said, her voice steady. "But I'd appreciate it if someone could take a clear look at what's happening here." Simmons' gaze shifted back to Wilks, his expression hardening. "Wilks," he said, his tone sharp, "care to explain why I just got a report of an altercation in the park involving you?" "There's no altercation," Wilks said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. "This woman, she's been acting suspicious, refusing to comply, resisting arrest. I was doing my job." Simmons raised an eyebrow, his skepticism deepening. "Resisting arrest?" he repeated. "From where I'm standing, she doesn't look like someone who's resisting." Wilks' face reddened, his frustration bubbling over. "She's not cooperating," he insisted, his voice rising. "She's a threat." "A threat?" Simmons asked, his tone incredulous. He gestured toward Grace. "She's standing still, Wilks. Explain to me how that's threatening." Grace stayed silent, letting the exchange play out. She could see the cracks widening in Wilks' facade, his inability to justify his actions becoming more apparent with every word. Simmons stepped closer, his presence commanding but not aggressive. His gaze remained locked on Wilks, pinning him in place like a spotlight. "I think we need to take a step back here," Simmons said, his voice firm. "This doesn't look like it's going in a good direction." Wilks opened his mouth to argue, but Simmons cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Enough," he said. "I'll handle this." Turning to Grace, Simmons softened his tone. "Ma'am, would you mind telling me your side of the story?" Grace hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking to Wilks. His jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. She could see the barely contained fury in his posture, the way his fists flexed at his sides. But Simmons' presence felt like a lifeline, a crack of light breaking through the darkness. "I was walking home," Grace began, her voice calm but firm. "Officer Wilks approached me, demanded to see what was in my bag, and then escalated things when I tried to assert my rights. I've complied with every reasonable request, but he's been aggressive and out of line." Simmons nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And the physical altercation?" he asked. "What happened there?" "Wilks attempted to detain me," Grace said evenly. "I defended myself." Simmons' gaze flicked back to Wilks, his expression hardening. "That true, Wilks?" "She attacked me." Wilks snapped, his voice trembling with anger. She resisted arrest and assaulted me." Simmons studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. "I'll be the judge of that," he said finally. "For now, we're going to de-escalate this situation. Wilks, stand down." Wilks bristled, his pride warring with the command. But Simmons' tone brooked no argument, and after a moment of hesitation, he took a grudging step back. The tension in the air began to dissipate, the weight of the moment lifting slightly. Grace let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. As Officer Simmons took control of the situation, the tension seemed to momentarily settle, but Grace could feel the storm still brewing just beneath the surface. Officer Wilks stood rigid, his face flushed with barely suppressed anger, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though it might snap. Every fiber of his body screamed frustration, and she could see that his retreat was only temporary. His eyes burned with humiliation, flicking between Grace and Simmons, who now stood as a mediator between them. Simmons turned to Grace again, his tone calm but firm. "Ma'am, I appreciate your cooperation so far. If you wouldn't mind staying here for a moment, we're going to sort this out properly. I'll make sure everything is handled fairly." Grace nodded, her expression steady but cautious. "Thank you, officer. That's all I'm asking for." But as soon as Simmons turned back to Wilks, Grace noticed a subtle shift in the officer's posture. His hands twitched at his sides, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. He wasn't backing down, not in his mind. To Wilks, this wasn't just about Grace anymore, it was about salvaging what little authority he believed he had left. Simmons didn't miss the tension radiating from his fellow officer. His voice dropped, low and firm. "Wilks, I don't know what's going on here, but I suggest you take a moment to calm yourself. You're not helping anyone by escalating this." Wilks' eyes flashed, his pride refusing to let him heed the advice. "She attacked me," he spat, his voice rising with indignation. "You saw her. She resisted arrest and assaulted a police officer. What do you want me to do? Let her get away with it?" Simmons raised an eyebrow, his expression a mix of skepticism and controlled irritation. "I saw her standing still when I arrived, Wilks. What I didn't see was any sign of aggression. You need to back off." Wilks' lip curled, his anger bubbling over. "Back off? Are you kidding me? She's dangerous. You're just going to take her word over mine." Simmons' gaze hardened, his authority bearing down on Wilks like a weight. Right now, I'm taking control of the situation because you clearly can't. I suggest you think carefully about your next move. The crowd of joggers, still lingering at a safe distance, whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between the officers and Grace. The murmurs weren't loud enough to decipher, but Wilks could feel their judgment, their quiet questioning of his behavior. It only added fuel to the fire already raging inside him. He had always prided himself on commanding respect, but in this moment he felt utterly exposed, his flaws, his temper, his biases, all laid bare for everyone to see. Wilks took a step forward, his hands balling into fists. "You're making a mistake, Simmons," he said, his voice low and menacing. "She's not innocent. I can feel it. People like her are always hiding something." Simmons stiffened at the remark, his jaw tightening. "People like her," he repeated, his voice sharp. "Watch your tone, Wilks. You're stepping into dangerous territory." Grace felt a pang of anger at Wilks' words, but she kept her expression neutral. She had heard similar comments before, veiled in just enough ambiguity to offer plausible deniability, but laced with venom nonetheless. It was a familiar tactic, one she had learned to counter with composure and strength, but this time she could sense something darker in Wilks' tone, a desperation that hinted at just how far he might be willing to go. Wilks shook his head, his frustration spilling over. "You don't get it, Simmons. She's not some innocent bystander. Look at her. She's too calm, too collected. Normal people don't act like that when they're confronted by a cop. She's hiding something, and I'm going to find out what." Simmons stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "You're not going to do anything but stand down and let me handle this. If you can't, I'll have no choice but to report you. Is that clear?" Wilks glared at Simmons, his face a mask of defiance. For a moment it seemed as though he might comply, but then his eyes flicked back to Grace. The sight of her calm, unyielding, and seemingly untouched by his attempt to intimidate her was too much for him to bear. Without warning, he lunged forward, his hand reaching for the taser clipped to his belt. The motion was quick, but Grace's reflexes were quicker. She saw the shift in his weight, the tightening of his jaw, the telltale signs of an impending attack. Her body moved on instinct, honed through years of training. As Wilks charged, she sidestepped gracefully, her movements fluid and deliberate. Her hand shot out, deflecting his arm and sending the taser skidding across the ground. Wilks stumbled, his momentum carrying him past her. He whirled around, his face contorted with rage, but Grace was already in position, her stance grounded and unshakable. She didn't strike, didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to send a clear message. She was in control. Enough. Simmons' voice thundered through the park, cutting through the chaos like a blade. He stepped between them, his broad frame blocking Wilks' path. His glare was ice-cold, his authority unmistakable. "Stand down, Wilks." "That's an order." Wilks froze, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment it looked as though he might argue, but the steel in Simmons' gaze left no room for debate. Slowly, reluctantly, he stepped back, his hands trembling with barely contained fury. Grace remained still, her breathing steady, her eyes locked on Wilks. She could see the storm still raging inside him, the war between his pride and the reality of his defeat. She knew this wasn't over, not entirely, but for now, the immediate danger had passed. Simmons turned to Grace, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone calm but concerned. Grace nodded, her voice steady. "I'm fine, officer. Thank you." Simmons gave a small nod before turning back to Wilks. His voice hardened again, each word carrying the weight of authority. "We're done here. I'm taking this to the precinct, and we'll sort it out properly. You're officially relieved of duty for the rest of the night." Wilks' face turned crimson, his fists clenching at his sides. "You can't do that," he spat, his voice trembling with indignation. "You don't have the authority." "I do," Simmons interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I'm exercising it now. Go back to your car, Wilks, that's an order." The joggers, sensing the shift in power, began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the night. Wilks hesitated, his gaze darting between Simmons and Grace, before finally turning on his heel and storming off, his footsteps heavy with frustration. Simmons let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He turned back to Grace, his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said. "I'll make sure this is handled appropriately." Grace studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. She could see the sincerity in his expression, the quiet determination to make things right. Slowly she nodded. "Thank you," she said. "That's all I ask." As Simmons radioed for backup to document the scene, Grace allowed herself a moment to breathe. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying with it a faint sense of relief. But even as the immediate danger faded, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Wilks' anger, his unchecked bias, and his willingness to escalate those were symptoms of a deeper problem, one that wouldn't be solved by a single confrontation. For now, though, she was content to let Simmons take the lead. She had fought her battle, and she had won. But the war, she knew, was still ahead. As the tension in the park began to subside, Grace remained rooted in place, her body still poised, her senses attuned to every movement around her. The adrenaline that had surged through her veins now simmered beneath the surface, not yet willing to dissipate. She watched as Officer Wilks stormed away, his shoulders rigid with barely contained fury, muttering under his breath. Though he had been ordered to leave the scene, Grace could feel his eyes burning into her back as he retreated toward his patrol car. Even in defeat, he radiated hostility, a storm that had been temporarily quelled but not extinguished. Officer Simmons stood beside her, his presence calm but authoritative. His radio crackled as he called for backup, requesting another officer to assist in documenting the situation. Grace observed him carefully, noting the measured way he handled the aftermath of the incident. There was no panic in his movements, no unnecessary theatrics. For the first time that night, Grace felt a glimmer of reassurance, not because she trusted the system, but because Simmons seemed to genuinely understand the gravity of what had just transpired. "Thank you for your patience," Simmons said, turning his attention to Grace. His tone was level, but there was an undercurrent of respect in his words. "I know this has been a difficult situation. I'll make sure this is handled properly." Grace nodded, her gaze steady. "I appreciate that, officer," she replied, her voice calm but edged with the lingering tension of the encounter. "But I hope you understand this isn't just about tonight. What happened here is part of a bigger problem." Simmons hesitated, his expression flickering with acknowledgement. "I do understand," he said finally, "and I'll do what I can to ensure accountability." Before Grace could respond, the sound of a car door slamming shattered the relative quiet of the park. Both she and Simmons turned to see Wilks standing by his squad car, his face flushed with rage. He was shouting into his radio, his gestures wild and frantic, though the exact words were hard to make out. Grace tensed, her instinct screaming that the danger wasn't over yet. She had seen this before. Men like Wilks didn't take humiliation lightly. "Stay here," Simmons said quickly, his voice dropping into a command. He began walking toward Wilks, his steps measured but purposeful, his hand resting near his own belt as a precaution. Grace watched, her jaw tightening. Though she trusted Simmons to handle the situation, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut that something was about to go terribly wrong. As Simmons approached, Wilks turned to face him, his expression a volatile mix of anger and desperation. His words became clearer as Grace moved closer, unwilling to let herself be entirely sidelined. "You can't just override me like that," Wilks was shouting, his voice trembling with frustration. "I'm not letting her walk away after what she did." "What she did?" Simmons replied, his tone sharp and incredulous. "Wilks, I saw what happened. You escalated this situation, and now you're making it worse. You've been ordered to stand down, don't make me repeat myself." Wilks shook his head violently, his hands gesturing erratically. "You don't understand. She's dangerous. You didn't see how she moved, how she attacked me." His voice cracked as he spoke, the sheer disbelief of his own words betraying him. Simmons took another step forward, his posture firm. "What I saw," he said coldly, "was a citizen defending herself from an officer who couldn't control his temper. If you keep pushing this, you're going to make things worse for yourself. Walk away, Wilks." But Wilks didn't walk away. Instead, he reached into his car, his movements frantic and reckless. Grace's breath hitched as she saw him pull out his baton, gripping it tightly as though it were a lifeline. His eyes darted toward Grace, his intent clear even before he spoke. "She's not getting away with this," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Wilks, stop," Simmons barked, stepping into his path. "Put it down now. This is your final warning." But Wilks was beyond reason. With a guttural shout, he shoved past Simmons, charging toward Grace with the baton raised. Time seemed to slow as the scene unfolded. Grace's body reacted instinctively, her training taking over as she braced herself for the attack. Wilks swung the baton with all his strength, but Grace sidestepped the blow with practiced precision, her movements fluid and controlled. As he stumbled forward, thrown off balance by his own momentum, Grace turned and executed a swift, precise maneuver. Her hand shot out, gripping his wrist and twisting it just enough to force him to release the baton. It clattered to the ground as she swept his legs out from under him, sending him sprawling onto the pavement with a grunt of pain. The sound of his body hitting the ground echoed through the park, a sharp punctuation to the chaotic scene. Grace stepped back immediately, her posture calm but ready, her eyes never leaving Wilks. He groaned, clutching his arm as he rolled onto his side, his face contorted with pain and humiliation. Simmons was there in an instant, his handcuffs out as he pinned Wilks to the ground. "That's enough," he barked, his voice commanding. "You're done, Wilks. You've crossed every line tonight, and now you're going to face the consequences." Wilks struggled weakly, his pride keeping him from surrendering entirely, but the fight had gone out of him. Simmons secured the cuffs around his wrists and hauled him to his feet, his expression a mixture of anger and disappointment. As backup officers arrived, the scene became a flurry of activity. Simmons quickly briefed them on what had happened, his words clipped and efficient. Wilks was led away, his head bowed. Though not out of shame, Grace could see the simmering rage still burning in his eyes. He wasn't done with her, not in his mind. But for now, he was out of the picture. One of the backup officers approached Grace, his demeanor cautious but professional. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked. Grace nodded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "I'm fine, thank you." Simmons walked over, his face weary but resolute. "I'll be filing a full report on this," he said. "You have my word that Wilks will be held accountable." Grace studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. She could see the sincerity there, but she also knew how often promises like this went unfulfilled. Still, She chose to accept his words at face value for now. "Thank you, Officer Simmons," she said. "I hope you understand that this isn't just about me. What happened tonight is part of a much larger problem." Simmons nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'll do what I can to address it." As the scene began to clear, Grace allowed herself a moment to breathe. The weight of the night's events settled on her shoulders, heavy but not unbearable. She had stood her ground, defended herself, and emerged unscathed. But the fight wasn't over. Wilks was just one man, a symptom of a deeper issue that would require far more than one confrontation to resolve. As she walked away from the park, the cool night air washing over her, Grace felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. She had faced injustice head-on and come out stronger, and she was determined to use her experience to make a difference. The battle for accountability and change was far from over, but Grace Harper was ready for it. The next morning, the sunlight poured through the windows of Grace's modest home, casting warm, golden rays across the room. She sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, her thoughts still tangled with the events of the previous night. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind a heavy sense of exhaustion, both physical and emotional. Grace stared into the swirling steam rising from her cup, replaying the confrontation with Officer Wilks in her mind. She had faced countless challenges in her life, but there was something uniquely exhausting about what had transpired. It wasn't just the physicality of the encounter, it was the sheer weight of what it represented. The systemic prejudice, the unchecked aggression, the way power could be so easily abused, it all felt so much bigger than one man, one night, one park. And yet, Grace couldn't ignore the small victories. She had stood her ground, she had defended herself, and, perhaps most importantly, she had forced accountability where it had been absent. Her phone buzzed on the table, jolting her from her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a message from an unknown number. Opening it cautiously, she read, "It's Harper, this is Officer Simmons. I wanted to thank you again for your patience and composure last night. I've filed my report, and Wilks is under review by Internal Affairs. If you'd like to discuss the case further or file your own complaint, please let me know. I'll support you in any way I can." Grace stared at the message for a long moment, a small flicker of hope stirring within her. Simmons had seemed sincere, and while she knew better than to place blind trust in anyone, his words felt like a step in the right direction. She typed a quick response thanking him and set the phone down, her thoughts turning to what she would do next. Later that day, Grace found herself back at the community center, the familiar hum of activity providing a welcome distraction from the lingering tension. The center was her sanctuary, a place where she could channel her energy into something constructive, something meaningful. The faces of her students, young and old, diverse in every way imaginable, reminded her why she did what she did. This was her way of fighting back, of building strength and resilience in others. As the class began, Grace moved through the room, demonstrating techniques and offering encouragement. Her students mirrored her movements, their focus sharp and their determination palpable. She could see the confidence growing in them with every session, and it filled her with a quiet pride. But her mind wasn't entirely on the class. The events of the night before lingered in her thoughts, weaving their way into her instructions. She found herself emphasizing not just the physical aspects of self-defense, but the mental ones as well. "Your strength isn't just in your body," she told the group, her voice steady and clear. "It's in your mind, your ability to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly even when everything feels like it's falling apart. That's how you take control of a situation." After class, as the students filed out with smiles and waves of gratitude, Grace lingered in the empty room. She stood in the center of the mats, her thoughts drifting once again to Wilks. His face, contorted with rage and frustration, was etched into her memory. She thought about the choices he had made, the way his anger had consumed him, and the damage it could have caused if she hadn't been able to defuse the situation. Her phone buzzed again, breaking her reverie. This time it was a call. The number was unfamiliar, but something told her to answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice cautious but firm. "Yes, Harper, this is Detective Avery from Internal Affairs," came the voice on the other end. It was calm and professional, but there was a weight to it that immediately captured Grace's attention. "I wanted to let you know that we've received the report about last night's incident. We've also reviewed Officer Wilks' history, and I'd like to speak with you further about what happened." Grace felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Of course," she replied. "I'm willing to help in any way I can." "Thank you," Avery said. "Your account will be important in ensuring that this matter is handled appropriately." "I'll be honest with you, Miss Harper, this isn't the first complaint we've received about Officer Wilks, but it's the first time we've had such clear evidence to act on. Your composure and the involvement of Officer Simmons have made a significant difference." The call ended shortly after, leaving Grace with a renewed sense of purpose. For years, she had quietly fought her battles, advocating for justice and equality in her own way. But this moment felt different. It felt bigger. She wasn't just defending herself anymore, she was part of something larger, a push for accountability that might, in some small way, create change. In the following days, the story began to spread not through sensational headlines or viral videos, but through word of mouth and quiet conversations. The joggers who had witnessed the confrontation told their friends and families about the composed woman who had stood her ground against a volatile officer. The community center buzzed with quiet admiration as students learned about what had happened. Grace didn't seek out the attention, but she didn't shy away from it either. When people asked, she told the truth, not to sensationalize the story, but to share what she had learned. One afternoon, as Grace prepared for another class, a familiar figure walked into the room. Officer Simmons stood in the doorway, his posture relaxed but his expression serious. Grace straightened, surprised but not unsettled by his presence. "Officer Simmons," she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to thank you in person," Simmons said, stepping forward, "and to let you know that Wilks has been suspended pending further investigation. Internal Affairs is taking this seriously, and I think it's because of how you handled yourself." Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "But this isn't just about me. There are countless others who don't get the chance to stand up for themselves, who don't have witnesses or officers like you to intervene." Simmons nodded, his face somber. "I know, and I can't fix the entire system, but I can do my part. If there's anything I can do to support you or the work you're doing here, you just have to ask." Grace studied him for a moment, weighing his sincerity. Finally, she extended a hand. "Thank you, Officer Simmons. I hope you'll hold on to that commitment." They shook hands, a small but significant gesture. As Simmons left, Grace felt a quiet sense of hope. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a start. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city settled into the rhythm of another night, Grace stood outside the community center, watching as students and visitors came and went. She thought about the battles still to be fought, the changes that still needed to happen. But she also thought about the strength she had seen in herself and others, the resilience that had carried her through. For the first time in a long while, Grace allowed herself to feel a sense of peace. The fight for justice was far from over, but she knew she wasn't alone in it. And that, she thought was enough to keep going.